100 Facts About Julius Caesar to Fall Asleep To. Close your eyes and let me tell you a story. A story that begins on a warm summer day in Rome, over 2,000 years ago, when the world was about to meet a man who would change it forever. Picture a narrow street in the Ceasar district. The air is thick with the smells of bread baking, wine fermenting, and too many people living too close together. This is not the gleaming marble Rome of emperors and monuments. This is the crowded, vibrant heart of the city, where shopkeepers call out their wares and children play in the dusty streets. And in a modest house on one of these winding lanes, on July 12th or 13th in the year 100 BCE, Aurelia held her newborn son for the first time. She named him Gaius Julius Caesar. The Caesar family could trace their lineage back to the goddess Venus herself, or so they claimed. But divine ancestry doesn't pay the bills, and the Caesars, though noble, were not wealthy. Still, Aurelia had dreams for her son. She would make sure he had every advantage she could provide. So young Julius grew up with the sounds of common Rome all around him. While other patrician boys lived in quiet villas on Rome's hills, Julius played in the Ceasar, walked its crowded streets, learned its rhythms. His mother watched him carefully, ensuring his education was rigorous. She hired the finest tutors, and the boy proved hungry for knowledge. He devoured literature, poetry, philosophy. By the time he was a teenager, he spoke Greek as fluently as Latin, reading Homer in the original and debating with his teachers about the great philosophers of Athens. But Rome was changing. Beyond the walls of their home, beyond the cheerful chaos of the Ceasar, something dark was growing. Two men, both powerful, both ambitious, were tearing the Republic apart. One was named Marius. The other was Sulla. And they hated each other with a hatred that would drown Roman blood. Marius happened to be married to Caesar's Aunt Julia. This made him family. And in Rome, family ties were everything. Julius was just 16 when his father died. One day his father was there, the head of the household, and then suddenly he wasn't. The boy became a man overnight, responsible now for his mother, his family's honor, everything. It was 84 BCE, and the civil war was raging all around them. People disappeared in the night. Bodies appeared in the Tiber. Rome had become a dangerous place. It was during this dark time that young Caesar made a choice that revealed who he truly was. He had been engaged to a girl named Caesar, a safe match to a wealthy family. But Caesar broke off the engagement and instead married Cornelia, the daughter of Cinna, one of Marius's closest allies. It was a declaration. A choice. He was saying, "This is my side. This is where I stand." Then Sulla won. When Sulla marched into Rome and declared himself dictator, he began settling scores. Anyone connected to Marius was in danger. And Caesar, now married to Cinna's daughter, was very connected indeed. Sulla's message came: divorce her. It was simple. Divorce Cornelia, and you can keep your life, your property, your future. Refuse, and lose everything. Caesar was 19 years old. He refused. Think about that for a moment. A teenager, facing the most powerful man in Rome, a dictator who had killed thousands, and Caesar simply said no. He would not abandon his wife. Sulla stripped him of his inheritance, took Cornelia's dowry, removed him from his position as a priest of Jupiter. And then came the order for his arrest. For months, Caesar lived as a fugitive. He moved from house to house, never sleeping in the same place twice. Every knock on the door could be soldiers coming to drag him away. Every shadow could be an informer. His friends hid him, moved him, kept him one step ahead of death. His mother called in every favor she had. The Vestal Virgins themselves, the most sacred women in Rome, pleaded for his life. Finally, Sulla relented. He pardoned the young man. But as he did, he said something chilling to those who had begged for Caesar's life. "Very well, take him. But know this, in that boy, I see many Mariuses." It was a prophecy and a warning. Sulla, who understood power better than anyone, saw something in Caesar that frightened him. With his life spared but Rome too dangerous, Caesar made a decision. He would leave. He would join the army, serve in the east, make a name for himself far from Sulla's watchful eyes. In 81 BCE, at 19 years old, Caesar boarded a ship bound for Asia Minor. He stood at the rail, watching Rome fade into the distance behind him, not knowing that one day he would return to that city as its master. Not knowing that his name would become the word for emperor in languages that didn't even exist yet. But that was still to come. For now, he was just a young man, sailing toward an unknown future, carrying with him the courage he had already shown and the ambition that Sulla had recognized. The waves rolled beneath the ship. Caesar looked east, toward whatever awaited him there. The eastern provinces of Rome were a world away from the Suburra. Here, ancient kingdoms had stood for thousands of years before Rome was even founded. Greek cities dotted the coastline, their white columns gleaming in the Mediterranean sun. And it was here, in the service of Marcus Minucius Thermus, that Caesar would prove himself as more than just a defiant young nobleman. The year was 80 BCE, and Thermus was besieging the city of Mytilene on the island of Lesbos. It was brutal work, the kind of grinding siege warfare that tested men's courage and endurance. And in the heat of battle, Caesar distinguished himself. He fought with such bravery that Thermus awarded him the civic crown, the Corona Civica, made of oak leaves. This was no ordinary decoration. It was given only to a soldier who had saved the life of a Roman citizen in battle. Caesar wore it proudly, and by Roman law, he had earned the right to wear it for the rest of his life. But there was a shadow over this achievement, a rumor that would follow Caesar for years. He had been sent on a diplomatic mission to King Nicomedes of Bithynia to secure ships for the siege. Caesar spent time at the king's court, perhaps longer than necessary, and whispers began. Enemies would later claim there had been an inappropriate relationship between the young Roman and the older king. True or not, these rumors would haunt Caesar throughout his political career, used as weapons by those who wished to destroy his reputation. When news reached the east that Sulla had died in 78 BCE, Caesar made his decision. Rome was safe again. He could go home. He sailed back across the Mediterranean, back to the city of his birth, ready to begin his political career in earnest. He was 22 years old, a decorated war hero, and hungry to make his mark. But Caesar's path to glory took an unexpected detour. On his way to Rhodes, where he planned to study rhetoric with the famous teacher Apollonius Molon, his ship was attacked. Pirates swarmed aboard, and Caesar found himself captured, a prisoner held for ransom. The pirates demanded 20 talents of silver for his release, a substantial sum. Caesar laughed at them. He insisted they ask for 50 talents instead. He was a Caesar, after all, and worth far more than a mere 20 talents. For 38 days, Caesar lived among these pirates as their captive. And he did so with extraordinary confidence, almost as if he were their guest rather than their prisoner. He joked with them, participated in their exercises, even recited poetry he had written, and grew angry when they didn't appreciate it enough. When they were too loud and disturbed his sleep, he would shout at them to be quiet. And all the while, he told them with a smile that once he was free, he would return and crucify every single one of them. The pirates thought this was hilarious. They had no idea he meant every word. His friends gathered the ransom, 50 talents of silver, and the pirates released him as agreed. Caesar immediately went to Miletus, gathered ships and men, and sailed straight back to the pirates' base. He captured them all. He recovered his 50 talents and took all their treasure besides. And then, true to his word, he had them crucified. Though he did show them one mercy, he had their throats cut first, so they would die quickly rather than suffering for days on the cross. Even in vengeance, there was calculation. With the pirates dealt with, Caesar continued to Rhodes and studied with Apollonius, honing his skills in rhetoric and oratory. These skills would serve him well, for Rome was a republic where power came through persuasion as much as through force. A man who could sway the Senate or move a crowd could change the course of history. When Caesar returned to Rome, he began his career in the law courts, prosecuting corrupt officials and making a name for himself. His oratory was powerful, his arguments sharp. People began to take notice of this young man with the famous name and the golden tongue. But legal cases were only the beginning. Caesar understood that real power in Rome required political office, military command, and most of all, money and connections. In 69 BCE, when Caesar was 31, both his aunt Julia and his wife Cornelia died within months of each other. At his aunt's funeral, Caesar did something unprecedented. He displayed images of Marius, her husband, in the funeral procession. For 20 years, since Sulla's victory, no one had dared to publicly honor Marius's memory. But Caesar did. He stood before the Roman people and delivered a funeral oration praising Marius, reclaiming his family's legacy, announcing that the time of fear was over. The crowd roared their approval. They remembered Marius as a champion of the common people, and now here was his nephew's son, young and charismatic, standing up for them. At Cornelia's funeral, Caesar's grief was genuine and visible. He had loved her, the woman he had refused to divorce even when it meant defying a dictator. Now she was gone, taken by illness, leaving him with their young daughter Julia. Caesar mourned her publicly, which was unusual. Roman men typically didn't display such emotion over a wife's death. But Caesar was never typical. The following year, Caesar remarried. His new wife was Pompeia, the granddaughter of Sulla. Yes, that Sulla. The dictator who had wanted him dead. It was a strategic marriage, connecting him to powerful families and showing that Caesar could be pragmatic when necessary. Love was one thing. Politics was another. And Caesar was learning to master both. In Rome, there was a ladder that ambitious men climbed, a series of political offices called the cursus honorum, the course of honors. Each rung brought more power, more prestige, more opportunity. And Caesar, now in his 30s, began to climb. In 65 BCE, Caesar was elected to the position of aedile, one of the officials responsible for public works and, crucially, public entertainment. This was his chance to make the people of Rome love him. And Caesar understood something that many nobles didn't, that the masses had power, even in a republic dominated by aristocrats. So he spent lavishly. He hosted magnificent games, spectacular gladiatorial contests that left the crowds cheering his name. He repaired public buildings and temples. He spent so much money that he plunged himself deep into debt. But debt, to Caesar, was just another form of investment. The people would remember his generosity. And their memory would be worth more than gold. During this time, Caesar also held the position of curator of the Appian Way, one of Rome's most important roads. He spent his own money he didn't have, repairing and maintaining it. His creditors were becoming nervous. Caesar owed vast sums to multiple lenders. But he kept spending, kept building his reputation, kept making himself indispensable to the common people of Rome. In 63 BCE, opportunity came in an unexpected form. The position of Pontifex Maximus, the chief priest of Rome, became vacant. This was one of the most prestigious religious offices in the Republic, typically held by elder statesmen, men who had spent decades climbing to such heights. Caesar was only 37 years old, still relatively junior. But he wanted it. And in Rome, the Pontifex Maximus was elected by the people, not appointed by the Senate. So Caesar campaigned. He borrowed even more money to bribe voters, spending so recklessly that on the morning of the election, he told his mother that he would either return home as Pontifex Maximus or not return at all. He would have to flee Rome to escape his creditors. His mother watched him leave, not knowing if she would ever see him again. But Caesar's gamble paid off. He won the election by a landslide, defeating two of the most distinguished men in Rome. At 37, he became the chief priest of the Roman religion, a position he would hold for the rest of his life. The office came with a magnificent house in the Forum, the very heart of Rome. Caesar moved from the Subura to the center of power. That same year, Rome was shaken by conspiracy. A bitter nobleman named Catiline, frustrated by his own failed political career, organized a plot to overthrow the government, burn the city, and murder the Senate. The conspiracy was exposed by the consul Cicero, Rome's greatest orator and a fierce defender of the Republic. The captured conspirators sat in chains, awaiting judgment. Most senators called for their immediate execution. But Caesar stood up in the Senate and argued against it. Not because he supported the conspiracy, he didn't, but because executing Roman citizens without trial set a dangerous precedent. His speech was eloquent and persuasive, and for a moment, it seemed the Senate might spare the conspirators. But then Cato the Younger, Caesar's bitter enemy, gave a counter-speech so powerful that the Senate voted for execution. The conspirators were strangled in the Tullianum, Rome's underground prison. Caesar had lost this battle, but people remembered his principled stance. And they remembered that he had tried to uphold the law, even for traitors. The following year, 62 BCE, Caesar was elected praetor, another step up the ladder. He was now one of the senior magistrates of Rome, with judicial and military authority. But that same year brought scandal. During the festival of Bona Dea, a religious ceremony held in Caesar's house and attended only by women, a man was discovered in disguise among them. His name was Publius Clodius Pulcher, a wild young aristocrat. Rumors flew that Clodius was having an affair with Caesar's wife, Pompeia, and that she had helped him sneak into the ceremony. Rome was scandalized. The sacred rites had been violated. Caesar's response was swift. He divorced Pompeia immediately. When asked to testify at Clodius's trial, however, Caesar said he knew nothing about any affair. The Senate was confused. If he knew nothing, why divorce her? Caesar's answer became famous: Caesar's wife must be above suspicion. It didn't matter if Pompeia was guilty or innocent. The mere rumor of impropriety was enough. Caesar's household, Caesar's name, had to be spotless. It was a lesson in reputation management, in understanding that in politics, perception mattered as much as truth. After his year as praetor, Caesar was assigned to govern Hispania Ulterior, further Spain, one of Rome's provinces. This was standard practice. Former praetors were sent to govern provinces, to gain administrative experience and military glory. But Caesar couldn't leave Rome. His debts had caught up with him. His creditors literally blocked his departure, demanding payment before they would let him go. Caesar was trapped, broke, and humiliated. Then Marcus Licinius Crassus stepped in. Crassus was the richest man in Rome, possibly the richest man in the world. He had made his fortune through property speculation, buying up burning buildings in Rome for pennies and then putting out the fires with his private fire brigade. He also owned silver mines and dealt in slaves. He had money, vast amounts of it, but he lacked the political success and military glory that Caesar seemed destined for. So Crassus paid off enough of Caesar's debts to satisfy the creditors. It was an investment. Caesar could go to Spain, and Crassus had just purchased the loyalty of a rising star. In Spain, Caesar finally had military command again. And he thrived. He led campaigns against the tribes in the interior, winning victories, taking plunder, enriching himself and his soldiers. For the first time in years, Caesar's financial situation improved. His men loved him because he fought alongside them, shared their hardships, and made sure they were well paid from the spoils of war. By the time he returned to Rome in 60 BCE, Caesar had transformed himself from a debt-ridden politician into a successful general with money, fame, and an army's loyalty behind him. He was ready for the next step. And the next step would change everything. When Caesar returned to Rome from Spain in 60 BCE, he faced a choice. He had won enough military victories to qualify for a triumph, that spectacular parade through Rome where a victorious general was celebrated like a god for a day, riding in a golden chariot while the city cheered. It was the highest honor a Roman general could receive. But there was a problem. To celebrate a triumph, a general had to wait outside the city walls with his army until the Senate granted permission. And Caesar wanted something else even more. He wanted to run for consul, the highest political office in Rome. But to run for consul, he had to enter the city and register his candidacy in person, which meant giving up his military command and his right to a triumph. The Senate, filled with men who feared Caesar's growing popularity, refused to make an exception. Choose, they told him. Glory or power? The triumph or the consulship? Caesar didn't hesitate. He entered the city, gave up the triumph, and declared his candidacy for consul. He chose power. Glory could wait. But running for consul required resources Caesar didn't have, even after his success in Spain. So he turned to the two most powerful men in Rome and proposed something audacious. He would bring together Crassus, the richest man in Rome, and Pompey the Great, the Republic's most celebrated general. These two men despised each other, rivals competing for dominance. But Caesar convinced them that together, they could control Rome. Crassus would provide the money, Pompey would provide military prestige and political support, and Caesar would provide the energy and political skill to make it all work. This informal alliance became known as the First Triumvirate, though they never called it that. To the public, it was just three powerful friends helping each other. In reality, it was a conspiracy to dominate the Republic. With their support, Caesar was elected consul in 59 BCE at the age of 41. He had reached the summit of Roman politics. But Caesar as consul was unlike any consul Rome had seen before. He didn't share power with his co-consul, a conservative senator named Bibulus. Instead, Caesar pushed through his agenda with such force that Bibulus eventually gave up trying to oppose him and simply stayed home, declaring every day a holy day to try to prevent official business. Romans joked that the year should be dated not as the consulship of Caesar and Bibulus but as the consulship of Julius and Caesar. Caesar had essentially become the sole ruler of Rome, at least for that year. One of his first acts was to secure land for Pompey's veterans. Pompey had promised his soldiers land when they retired, but the Senate had blocked it for years. Caesar forced the legislation through, earning Pompey's eternal gratitude and the loyalty of thousands of retired soldiers. He also passed a law requiring the publication of Senate proceedings and assemblies, making the government more transparent, or at least making sure everyone knew what Caesar was accomplishing. To cement his alliance with Pompey, Caesar offered him something precious, his daughter Julia. Julia was in her early 20s, beautiful and accomplished, and she had been engaged to another man. Caesar broke off that engagement and married her to Pompey, who was in his late 40s. It was a purely political marriage on Caesar's part, using his daughter as a diplomatic tool. But something unexpected happened. Pompey and Julia actually fell in love. Their marriage became genuine, affectionate, one of the rare political unions in Rome that blossomed into real devotion. Julia became the tie that bound Caesar and Pompey together, the human connection that kept their alliance strong. Caesar himself remarried as well. His new wife was Calpurnia, daughter of Lucius Calpurnius Piso, a wealthy and influential senator. It was another strategic marriage, but Calpurnia would remain Caesar's wife for the rest of his life. a steady presence through all the triumphs and disasters to come. As his consulship neared its end, Caesar needed to secure his future. Roman law granted consuls immunity from prosecution while in office, but the moment he became a private citizen again, his enemies would drag him into court on charges of illegality during his consulship. He needed another position with immunity, one that would also give him the resources to become truly powerful. So Caesar arranged to be appointed governor of 3 provinces, Cisalpine Gaul, Transalpine Gaul, and Illyricum. This gave him command of 4 legions and control of a vast territory stretching from northern Italy across the Alps into what is now France and Switzerland. The appointment was for 5 years, later extended to 10. It was an unprecedented grant of power, and it put Caesar in command of an army far from the Senate's oversight. As he prepared to leave Rome for Gaul in 58 BCE, Caesar was 42 years old. Behind him lay a career of calculated risks, massive debts repaid with political success, and a knack for turning enemies into allies and scandals into opportunities. Ahead of him lay Gaul, a land of fierce tribes and enormous wealth. Caesar told his friends he was going to civilize the barbarians and secure Rome's northern frontier. What he didn't say, but surely knew, was that he was going to build an army loyal to him personally, win glory that would eclipse even Pompey's, and gather wealth beyond measure. The Roman Republic had just 8 years of peace left, though no one knew it yet. And Caesar, riding north toward Gaul with his legions behind him, was about to become the storm that would sweep the old world away. Gaul in 58 BCE was not one nation but many. Hundreds of tribes lived across the vast territory, speaking similar languages, worshipping similar gods, but constantly warring with each other. They were fierce warriors, tall and imposing, with long hair and mustaches, fighting with iron swords and tremendous courage. The Romans called them barbarians, but Gaul had cities, trade, art, and a complex society. It was also fabulously wealthy, rich in gold, silver, and above all, slaves, the commodity Rome craved most. Caesar arrived to find Gaul in turmoil. A tribe called the Helvetii, living in what is now Switzerland, had decided to migrate westward through Roman territory. They numbered nearly 400,000 people, men, women, children, and elderly, all on the move, burning their villages behind them so there could be no turning back. Caesar saw this not as a humanitarian crisis but as an opportunity. He claimed they threatened Roman security and moved to intercept them. With his 4 legions, Caesar pursued the Helvetii, harassing their column, cutting off their supplies. Finally, near Bibracte, the Helvetii turned to fight. The battle was fierce and long. The Helvetii fought with desperate courage, knowing their families were behind them. But Roman discipline prevailed. Caesar's legions held formation, their javelins and short swords doing terrible work. By day's end, the Helvetii were shattered. Of the 400,000 who had begun the migration, only 110,000 survived to return home, defeated and humiliated. Caesar had won his first major victory in Gaul, and he had done so decisively. But Caesar's campaign didn't end there. Word reached him that Ariovistus, a German king, had crossed the Rhine with his warriors and was occupying Gallic territory, threatening tribes who were Roman allies. Caesar marched north to confront him. The 2 leaders met for negotiations, and it went poorly. Ariovistus was arrogant, dismissive. He had no fear of Rome. So Caesar prepared for battle. His soldiers, however, were terrified. They had heard stories about the Germans, that they were even larger and fiercer than the Gauls, that they were unbeatable in combat. Panic spread through the camp. Veteran centurions suddenly remembered urgent business elsewhere. Young officers drafted their wills. Caesar watched his army dissolving before his eyes, not from enemy action but from fear. So Caesar called an assembly. He stood before his frightened legions and gave a speech that became legendary. He shamed them for their cowardice, reminded them of their pride as Roman soldiers, told them of the German weaknesses he had learned. And then he made a brilliant tactical move. He announced that if no one else would march with him, he would take only the 10th Legion, his most loyal unit, and they would win the victory alone. This stung the other legions' pride. If the 10th would fight, how could they refuse? The panic broke. The army would march. The battle against Ariovistus was brutal but decisive. Caesar's legions crashed into the German lines with fury, and the Germans, for all their reputation, broke and fled. Ariovistus himself barely escaped, crossing back over the Rhine. Caesar had now defeated both the Helvetii and the Germans in a single campaign season. Rome was astounded. Here was a general who won victories as easily as other men won elections. Caesar spent the winter of 58 to 57 BCE among his troops, not returning to Rome or even to Cisalpine Gaul. This was unusual. Most governors spent winters in comfort. But Caesar stayed with his army, sharing their hardships, learning their names, understanding their concerns. He was building something more than an army. He was building a brotherhood of men loyal to him personally. The next year brought new challenges. The Belgae, a confederation of fierce tribes in northern Gaul, in what is now Belgium, saw what Caesar had done to their southern neighbors and decided to unite against him before he could attack them. They raised a massive army, reportedly 300,000 warriors, the largest force yet assembled against Rome and Gaul. Caesar marched north with 8 legions now. He had raised 4 more with his own money and authority. The campaign against the Belgae was savage. Tribe after tribe fought and fell. The Nervii, considered the fiercest of all Belgian tribes, ambushed Caesar's legions while they were making camp near the Sabas River. It was nearly a disaster. The Nervii charged out of the forest in perfect silence, crashing into the Roman column before they could fully deploy. Legionaries scrambled for their weapons. Centurions shouted orders. Caesar himself grabbed a shield and rushed into the front line, fighting alongside his men, rallying them with his presence. The battle hung in the balance. Roman discipline was barely holding against Belgian fury. Then the 10th Legion, which had been in the rear, came charging into the fight. The tide turned. The Nervii fought to the last man rather than retreat, their courage extraordinary even in defeat. After the Battle of the Sabas, Caesar wrote that of the Nervii's Senate of 600 men, only 3 survived, and of their 60,000 warriors, barely 500 remained. It was annihilation. By the end of 57 BCE, after just 2 years in Gaul, Caesar had conquered most of the region. He sent dispatches to Rome describing his victories, and the Senate voted him an unprecedented 20 days of thanksgiving. No general had ever been honored with such a lengthy celebration. Caesar's fame was growing with each victory, each battle report, each letter sent back to Rome describing his exploits. The people loved him. The Senate was beginning to fear him. And in Gaul, among the tribes, a realization was slowly dawning. This Roman general was unlike any they had faced before. He was not just raiding for plunder. He was conquering. He was staying. And if they didn't unite against him, their world would be swept away. In 56 BCE, Caesar faced restlessness back in Rome. His alliance with Pompey and Crassus was showing cracks. Political enemies were circling. So the 3 men met at Lucca, a town in northern Italy, and renewed their compact. They agreed that Pompey and Crassus would be consuls together the following year, and that Caesar's command in Gaul would be extended for another 5 years. The triumvirate was reborn, and Caesar's position was secure. He could continue his conquest without looking over his shoulder. That same year, Caesar turned his attention to the Atlantic coast. Tribes there, particularly the Veneti, were seafaring people with powerful ships, much better suited to the rough Atlantic waters than Rome's Mediterranean galleys. The Veneti lived in fortified settlements on coastal promontories, accessible only at low tide. When Caesar's legions approached, they simply loaded their people and possessions onto ships and sailed to another stronghold. It was frustrating, almost impossible to defeat them with traditional Roman tactics. So Caesar built a fleet. In a matter of months, his legions constructed warships on the Loire River, learning shipbuilding as they went. When the fleets finally met in battle in Quiberon Bay, Caesar's ships were outmatched in design. The Veneti vessels were higher, stronger, built for Atlantic storms. But Roman ingenuity won the day. Caesar's men used long poles with sharp hooks to cut the Veneti ships' rigging. Without sails, the enemy vessels were helpless. Roman soldiers boarded them one by one, and the Veneti fleet was destroyed. It was Rome's first naval victory in the Atlantic Ocean, a body of water most Romans had never even seen. But Caesar's ambitions stretched even further. Beyond Gaul lay two mysterious lands that existed more in legend than reality for most Romans: Germania, land of the fearsome German tribes, and Britannia, the island at the edge of the world, shrouded in mist and mystery. Caesar decided he would be the first Roman to set foot in both. In 55 BCE, German tribes crossed the Rhine again, seeking refuge in Gaul. Caesar met with their leaders under a flag of truce to negotiate their return. Then, controversially, he had them seized during the negotiations and ordered an attack on their camp. The Germans, leaderless and unprepared, were slaughtered. It was brutal, and even in Rome, some senators, including Cato, called it dishonorable. But Caesar had made his point: cross the Rhine uninvited, and there would be consequences. Then Caesar did something unprecedented. He ordered his engineers to build a bridge across the Rhine. The river was wide, swift, and deep. No Roman army had ever crossed it. But in just 10 days, Roman engineering genius produced a marvel: a wooden bridge supported by massive pilings, strong enough to carry legions. Caesar marched his army across into Germania, the first Roman general to do so. He stayed for 18 days, burning villages, showing the German tribes that the Rhine was no barrier to Roman power. Then he marched back, destroyed the bridge behind him, and turned his eyes toward Britain. The expedition to Britain in 55 BCE was rushed, launched late in the summer. Caesar took 2 legions and a fleet of transport ships, crossing the narrow strait that separated Gaul from the mysterious island. But the Britons were waiting. As Roman ships approached the shore, warriors lined the cliffs and beaches, chariots racing along the coast, war cries echoing. The Roman soldiers hesitated, reluctant to leap from their ships into the surf while under attack. Then the standard-bearer of the 10th Legion jumped into the water, holding the eagle standard high, and shouted that he would not see Rome's sacred eagle dishonored. Shamed and inspired, the legionaries followed. They fought their way ashore in the surf, a desperate, chaotic battle. The British chariots were unlike anything Romans had seen. Warriors would ride close, throw javelins, then leap down to fight on foot while their drivers kept the chariots moving. It was bewildering and dangerous. Caesar established a small beachhead, but storms destroyed many of his ships. He had no cavalry, insufficient supplies, and winter was approaching. After just a few weeks, and a few skirmishes with local tribes, Caesar withdrew back to Gaul. It was hardly a conquest, barely even an invasion. But he had done it. He had crossed the ocean, as Romans called the sea beyond the Mediterranean, and set foot in Britain. Back in Rome, the propaganda value was immense. Caesar had gone beyond the known world and returned. The following year, 54 BCE, Caesar returned to Britain with a much larger force, 5 legions and 2,000 cavalry and 800 ships. It was the largest Roman fleet ever assembled. This time the landing was unopposed. The Britons had seen Roman determination and chose to withdraw inland. Caesar marched north, crossing the Thames River, and defeated the British leader Cassivellaunus. He didn't stay to conquer the island. That would take another century and a different emperor. But he had made his point. Rome's reach extended even here, to this foggy island at the world's edge. When Caesar returned to Gaul in late 54 BCE, he received devastating news. His daughter Julia had died in childbirth, along with her baby. She had been only in her 20s, the beloved wife of Pompey and Caesar's own cherished daughter. Caesar grieved deeply. But more than personal sorrow, Julia's death had political consequences. She had been the living bond between Caesar and Pompey, the tie of affection that kept their alliance strong. With her gone, that bond was broken. And far away in the east, more bad news was coming. Crassus, the third member of the triumvirate, had launched an invasion of Parthia, seeking military glory to match Caesar's and Pompey's. But the Parthians were not Gauls. At Carrhae, in the desert of Mesopotamia, Parthian horse archers destroyed Crassus's legions. Crassus himself was killed, his head cut off and used in a Parthian theatrical performance. The triumvirate was no more. Only Caesar and Pompey remained, circling each other like wolves, with no Julia to keep the peace between them. That winter of 54 to 53 BCE was harsh in Gaul. Caesar had distributed his legions across the territory in separate winter camps, spread thin across the conquered lands. It seemed safe. The Gauls had been quiet, apparently accepting Roman rule. But beneath the surface, resentment burned. And one man was about to turn that resentment into the greatest threat Caesar had yet faced. His name was Vercingetorix. He was young, charismatic, the son of a Gallic chieftain of the Arverni tribe. While other Gallic leaders had fought Caesar tribe by tribe, each alone and each defeated, Vercingetorix understood something crucial: only unity could defeat Rome. He began traveling from tribe to tribe, speaking of freedom, of their ancestors, of the shame of living under Roman domination. His words found fertile ground. In the winter, the Gauls rose. One of Caesar's winter camps, held by a legion and 5 cohorts under the command of Sabinus and Cotta, was surrounded. The Gallic leader Ambiorix told them they could leave safely if they surrendered the camp. It was a trick, but Sabinus believed him. Against Cotta's advice, Sabinus agreed to evacuate. They marched out, and the Gauls fell upon them in a ravine. Nearly every Roman soldier was killed, approximately 9,000 men, an entire legion destroyed. It was Rome's worst defeat in Gaul since Caesar's campaigns began. When news reached the other camps, panic spread. The legions were isolated, outnumbered, vulnerable. One camp in particular, held by Quintus Cicero, brother of the famous orator, was besieged by 60,000 Gauls. They built siege works, having learned Roman techniques by watching them. For days, Cicero's men held out, vastly outnumbered, supplies running low. Caesar, when he learned of the siege, immediately marched with 2 legions to relieve them. With only about 7,000 men, he approached an enemy force nearly 10 times his size. Caesar used deception, sending messages that were designed to be captured, claiming he had a much larger force. The Gauls abandoned the siege of Cicero and turned to face Caesar. Then, when they advanced, Caesar's disciplined legions cut them to pieces. The camp was saved, but it had been close. Too close. Caesar spent that winter consolidating his forces and preparing. He knew something had changed. This was no longer a conquest. This was a war for survival. And in the spring of 52 BCE, Vercingetorix revealed himself, uniting the tribes of Central Gaul under his command. He was proclaimed king by his people, a title the Gauls rarely used. His strategy was brilliant and devastating: avoid direct battle with Rome's superior legions, use scorched earth tactics, burn the crops in villages so Caesar's army would starve, and strike at Roman supply lines. It worked terrifyingly well. Caesar found himself marching through a wasteland. Every town his army approached was burned before he arrived. His soldiers were hungry, exhausted, and demoralized. When Caesar besieged the town of Avaricum, one of the few Vercingetorix had allowed to remain standing, the siege took weeks in terrible conditions. When the town finally fell, Caesar's soldiers, enraged and starving, massacred nearly all 40,000 inhabitants. It was brutal, even by Roman standards, a sign of how desperate the situation had become. Caesar then laid siege to Gergovia, Vercingetorix's own tribal capital. This time, the result was different. Caesar's assault on the town failed, and he was forced to retreat with significant losses, nearly 700 soldiers killed, including 46 centurions. It was a rare defeat, and Vercingetorix's prestige soared. More tribes joined the rebellion. Even tribes that had been loyal to Rome switched sides. Gaul was uniting against Caesar as never before. But Vercingetorix made a mistake. Flush with victory, he ordered his cavalry to attack Caesar's retreating army in open ground. The Gallic cavalry, some of the finest horsemen in the world, charged with confidence. But Caesar had recruited German cavalry as mercenaries, and in the ensuing battle, the Germans proved superior. The Gallic cavalry was routed, and Vercingetorix, his confidence shaken, retreated to the hilltop fortress of Alesia with his entire army, about 80,000 warriors. Caesar saw his opportunity. He would besiege Alesia. But this would be no ordinary siege. Alesia stood on a steep hill, surrounded by rivers and valleys, a naturally impregnable position. Caesar's engineers went to work on the greatest military engineering project of the ancient world. They built a ring of fortifications around Alesia, 11 miles of walls, trenches, and traps, completely surrounding the fortress. These walls faced inward, preventing the Gauls from escaping. But Caesar knew that Vercingetorix had sent for help before being surrounded. A relief army would come, massive and determined. So Caesar's engineers built a second ring of fortifications, 14 miles of walls, trenches, and obstacles, this time facing outward. Caesar was about to fight on two fronts simultaneously, surrounded himself while surrounding the enemy. His 60,000 soldiers would face 80,000 Gauls inside Alesia and, when they arrived, a relief force that ancient sources claimed numbered 250,000 warriors. The numbers were likely exaggerated, but even so, Caesar was outnumbered several times over. Inside Alesia, as the siege dragged on, food ran out. Vercingetorix expelled the civilians, women, children, elderly, hoping Caesar would let them through his lines or at least feed them. Caesar did neither. They sat in the no-man's land between the armies, starving, while both sides watched. It was a cruel calculation, but Caesar was fighting for his life and his army's survival. He could not afford mercy. Then the relief army arrived. From the heights of Alesia, Vercingetorix could see them, countless thousands, filling the valleys below. Signals were exchanged. The attack would come from both sides at once, crushing Caesar between them. It began at night. Gauls attacked from inside Alesia and from the relief army outside. The fighting raged along miles of fortifications in darkness, Romans rushing from threatened point to threatened point, barely holding the line. The next day, the attacks resumed with even greater intensity. Caesar rode along the fortifications, his distinctive red cloak visible to all, encouraging his men, directing reserves to critical points. The battle ebbed and flowed for hours. At one section of the outer wall, the Gauls broke through. Caesar personally led a cavalry counterattack, charging into the gap with his reserves. The sight of their general fighting in the front line inspired the legionaries. They pushed back, closed the breach, turned defense into counterattack. The Gauls broke. The relief army, seeing their assault fail despite overwhelming numbers, lost heart and began to retreat. Inside Alesia, Vercingetorix watched his last hope disappear into the distance. The next day, he rode out of the fortress alone, wearing his finest armor. He approached Caesar's camp, dismounted, and surrendered himself to save his people from annihilation. The siege of Alesia was over. The rebellion was broken. Vercingetorix was sent to Rome in chains. He would spend 6 years in prison in the Tullianum, that dark underground cell where Rome kept its most important captives, waiting for the day Caesar would celebrate his triumph and execute him before the crowds. For now, though, Gaul was pacified. Some tribes continued sporadic resistance, but the Great Rebellion was finished. Caesar spent 51 and 50 BCE mopping up the last resistance, securing his conquest, and most importantly, writing. Throughout his campaigns, Caesar had been sending dispatches to Rome, but now he compiled them into a comprehensive account. His commentaries on the Gallic Wars, Commentarii de Bello Gallico, became one of the most famous military memoirs ever written. Written in clear, elegant Latin, in the third person as if describing someone else's deeds, the work was both a historical record and a piece of propaganda. It made Caesar the hero of an epic, civilizing barbarians and extending Rome's glory. Students would read it for centuries, learning Latin from Caesar's own description of his conquests. He had won the war with his sword and now won the political battle with his pen. But while Caesar was writing in Gaul, Rome was descending into chaos. Pompey, without Julia to connect him to Caesar and without Crassus to balance the power, had been drifting toward the conservative Senate faction. Street violence had become so common that in 52 BCE, the Senate appointed Pompey sole consul, essentially making him dictator, to restore order. Pompey was now the Senate's champion, their weapon against Caesar's growing power. The Senate wanted Caesar to return to Rome as a private citizen, without his army, so they could prosecute him for illegal acts during his consulship years ago. Caesar knew that if he came back without his legions, his enemies would destroy him. He would be convicted, exiled, or worse. His only protection was his military command, which gave him legal immunity. But that command was set to expire in 49 BCE. Caesar tried to negotiate. He proposed that he be allowed to run for consul in absentia, while still in Gaul, so he could transition directly from one immune position to another. The Senate refused. He proposed that he and Pompey both give up their commands simultaneously, neither having military advantage. The Senate refused again, with Pompey's quiet approval. The message was clear: return without your army and face trial, or keep your army and become an enemy of the state. Two tribunes who supported Caesar, Mark Antony and Quintus Cassius, tried to veto the Senate's decrees against him. In a shocking break with Roman tradition, they were threatened with violence and forced to flee Rome for their own safety. When Caesar heard that tribunes, sacred, inviolable representatives of the people, had been driven from the Senate, he had his justification. He would claim he was defending the Republic's traditions, protecting the rights of tribunes, standing up for the common people against the corrupt Senate. On January 10, 49 BCE, Caesar stood with one legion, the 13th, at the banks of a small river called the Rubicon. This river marked the boundary between his province of Cisalpine Gaul and Italy proper. Roman law was absolute. No general could bring an army across this river toward Rome. To cross meant civil war. To not cross meant surrender and likely death. Caesar hesitated. According to the historian Suetonius, he stood there considering the enormity of what he was about to do. If he crossed, thousands of Romans would die in civil war. If he didn't, his career and probably his life were over. Then Caesar spoke, "I acta alia est," the die is cast. Some sources say he actually quoted Greek, "Let the die be cast." Either way, the meaning was clear. The gamble was made. He gave the order, and the 13th Legion marched across the shallow river into Italy. There was no battle, no resistance, Town after town opened their gates to Caesar. People came out to cheer him, seeing him as a champion against the corrupt aristocrats in Rome. Caesar's clemency helped. He pardoned enemies, refused to allow his soldiers to plunder, paid for supplies rather than taking them. This was not a barbarian invasion but a Roman general coming home. Pompey and the Senate panicked. They had expected time to raise armies, but Caesar moved with stunning speed. Within weeks, he was marching down Italy, and Pompey realized he couldn't hold Rome. The Senate evacuated the capital, fleeing south to the port of Brundisium. It was a chaotic, undignified retreat. Senators, magistrates, and Pompey himself abandoned Rome to Caesar. Caesar entered Rome unopposed in April 49 BCE. He had left the city 9 years earlier as a consul heading to Gaul. He returned as a conqueror, though he insisted he was a liberator. He tried to convene the Senate, but most senators had fled with Pompey. The few who remained watched nervously as Caesar spoke of peace, reconciliation, and the need to restore order. He didn't declare himself dictator, not yet. He broke into the treasury to fund his war. The tribunes tried to stop him, and Caesar simply moved them aside, noting wryly that threatening tribunes was easier in war than in peace. But Pompey was not finished. He had escaped to Greece with much of the Senate and was raising an army there. The Optimates, the conservative faction, controlled the eastern provinces and their resources. They had time, money, and legitimacy, the support of the official government. Caesar had speed, momentum, and his veteran legions, but he would have to chase Pompey across the Mediterranean. Before pursuing Pompey east, Caesar had to secure his rear. Pompey's lieutenants controlled Spain with 7 legions. Caesar marched there in a lightning campaign, declaring, "I go to meet an army without a leader, then I shall return to meet a leader without an army." In just 40 days, he outmaneuvered Pompey's forces in Spain, cutting off their supplies and forcing them to surrender without a major battle. Spain was his. Now nothing stood between Caesar and Pompey except the sea. And Caesar was about to cross it, pursuing his former friend and ally to the final confrontation that would decide the fate of Rome. In January of 48 BCE, in the middle of winter when no sane commander would risk crossing the stormy Adriatic, Caesar loaded his legions onto ships and sailed for Greece. Pompey had assembled a massive force there, 9 legions plus auxiliaries, and most importantly, complete control of the sea with his fleet. Caesar had only 7 legions and no fleet to speak of. It was a desperate gamble, but Caesar specialized in desperate gambles. He landed at Palast in Epirus and immediately marched inland before Pompey's fleet could intercept him. But he had only half his army. Mark Antony was still in Italy with the remaining legions, unable to cross because Pompey's ships controlled the Adriatic. For weeks, Caesar's army was outnumbered, cut off, vulnerable. He sent message after message urging Antony to risk the crossing. Finally, Antony succeeded, slipping through Pompey's blockade during a storm. When the two halves of Caesar's army united, they still faced longer odds, but at least they were together. The two armies maneuvered around each other in the hills and plains of Greece. Pompey, despite his numerical advantage, was cautious. He remembered Caesar's victories against superior numbers in Gaul. He would not be drawn into a rash battle. Instead, he shadowed Caesar's movements, denying him supplies, waiting for time and hunger to weaken the enemy. It was sound strategy. Caesar's troops were on half rations, foraging for anything edible. They even made bread from a root that grew locally, something usually fed to cattle. When Pompey's soldiers captured some of this bread and saw what Caesar's men were reduced to eating, they were disturbed. These weren't civilized men they were fighting, some muttered, but beasts who could survive on anything. Caesar tried to force battle by besieging Pompey's camp at Dyrrhachium. He built a massive line of fortifications trying to surround Pompey's larger army and cut them off from supplies. But Pompey broke through the fortifications, and in the fighting, Caesar's army suffered a serious defeat. Hundreds of veterans were killed, and Caesar was forced to retreat. It was arguably his worst tactical defeat in a conventional battle. As he withdrew, Caesar reportedly said, "Today the victory had been the enemy's, if they had had a commander who knew how to conquer." He was suggesting Pompey should have pursued and destroyed his retreating army but hadn't. Still, it was a bitter moment. Caesar's aura of invincibility had been cracked. Caesar retreated inland to Thessaly, and Pompey followed, finally willing to offer battle. Pompey's officers were confident, already arguing over who would receive which offices after they marched into Rome victorious. The Senate faction with Pompey treated the battle as a formality, Caesar's defeat as inevitable. They outnumbered him, outprovisioned him, and had just defeated him. What could go wrong? On August 9, 48 BCE, the two armies met on the plains near Pharsalus. Pompey had about 45,000 infantry and 7,000 cavalry. Caesar had about 22,000 infantry and only 1,000 cavalry. The numbers favored Pompey significantly. His plan was to use his cavalry to overwhelm Caesar's small cavalry force on the flank, then sweep around and attack Caesar's legions from behind. It was a good plan, and it should have worked. But Caesar anticipated it. He secretly positioned his best cohorts, about 2,000 men, as a hidden fourth line behind his cavalry. He instructed them specifically to target the faces of Pompey's cavalrymen with their javelins. These aristocratic young Roman nobles were vain about their looks and would flinch from facial wounds. When Pompey's cavalry charged and Caesar's cavalry retreated as planned, the hidden fourth line emerged. They rushed forward with their javelins aimed high, and Pompey's cavalry broke in panic, exactly as Caesar had predicted. With the cavalry gone, Caesar's hidden cohorts swung around and attacked Pompey's infantry from the side and rear. At the same moment, Caesar committed his reserves to a frontal assault. Pompey's legions, fighting on two fronts and seeing their cavalry fleeing, began to waver. The line broke. What had been a battle became a rout. Pompey's soldiers fled to their camp, and Caesar's veterans stormed it that same day. Pompey himself saw the battle was lost, tore off his general's cloak, and fled on horseback. The great Pompey, Rome's most celebrated general, had been decisively defeated by his former ally. Caesar showed his characteristic clemency to the captured soldiers. He offered them pardons and even recruited many into his own legions. But the senatorial leaders who fled with Pompey were a different matter. Caesar knew the war wouldn't end until Pompey was captured or dead. He pursued him across Greece, then across the Mediterranean. Pompey fled to Egypt, hoping the young pharaoh Ptolemy XIII would offer him sanctuary and aid. But Ptolemy's advisors made a calculation. Why anger the victor by helping the loser? When Pompey's boat approached the Egyptian shore near Pelusium, Ptolemy's men rowed out to greet him. Pompey stepped into their boat with a few attendants. As they reached the shallows, one of the Egyptians, a Roman soldier who had once served under Pompey, drew his sword and stabbed Pompey in the back. They killed him there in the boat, cut off his head, and left his body on the beach. Pompey the Great, who had conquered the East and stood as Rome's champion, died at age 58, murdered on an Egyptian beach for political expedience. 3 days later, Caesar landed in Egypt. The Egyptians presented him with Pompey's severed head and signet ring, expecting gratitude. Instead, Caesar wept. Whatever their political differences, Pompey had been his son-in-law, his ally, his friend. To see him end this way, murdered by foreigners, was genuinely painful. Caesar gave orders for Pompey's remains to be cremated with full honors and had his ashes sent to Pompey's widow, Cornelia. But Caesar couldn't leave Egypt immediately. The country was in turmoil. Young Ptolemy XIII was fighting with his older sister and co-ruler, Cleopatra, for control of the kingdom. Egypt was Rome's breadbasket, supplying much of the grain that fed the capital. Caesar decided he needed to settle this dispute before leaving. He ordered both rulers to appear before him to make their case. Cleopatra was only 21 years old, but she was brilliant and understood power better than her teenage brother. She knew that if she simply walked into the palace where Caesar was staying, her brother's men would kill her before she reached him. So she devised a plan. She had herself wrapped in a carpet, or possibly a linen sack for laundry, and had a trusted servant carry her past the guards into Caesar's private chambers. When the carpet was unrolled, there she was. It was an entrance Caesar would never forget, and neither would history. Caesar was 52 years old when he met Cleopatra. She was 21, but she spoke 9 languages, was educated in mathematics, philosophy, and astronomy, and possessed a charisma that rivaled Caesar's own. They became lovers almost immediately. What began as a political alliance became something more, genuine fascination, perhaps even love, though with two such calculating minds, it's hard to separate emotion from ambition. Caesar decided in Cleopatra's favor, declaring that she and her brother would rule Egypt jointly, as their fathers will had specified. But Ptolemy's advisors, seeing their power slipping away, stirred up the Alexandrian mob and the Egyptian army against Caesar. Suddenly, Caesar found himself besieged in the palace quarter of Alexandria with only 4,000 men facing 20,000 Egyptian soldiers. It was a dangerous situation. The Alexandrians even burned the docks to prevent Caesar from escaping by sea. In that fire, parts of the famous Library of Alexandria burned, one of history's great losses, though the library would survive in some form for centuries more. For months, Caesar was trapped in what became known as the Alexandrian War. He fought building by building, street by street, even in naval battles in the harbor. At one point, Caesar had to swim for his life from a sinking ship, holding important documents above his head with one hand while swimming with the other. He was nearly 53 years old, swimming through arrow fire, refusing to let go of his papers. Finally, reinforcements arrived from Rome and from Rome's client kingdoms in the region. With their help, Caesar defeated Ptolemy's forces. The young pharaoh drowned in the Nile trying to escape, weighted down by his golden armor. Cleopatra now ruled Egypt alone, with Caesar's blessing and protection. Before he left, she told him she was pregnant with his child. In June of 47 BCE, she gave birth to a boy they named Caesarion, Little Caesar. Caesar never officially acknowledged him as his son, which would have been politically dangerous in Rome, but everyone knew the truth. For the first time, Caesar had a son, even if he could never publicly claim him. Caesar couldn't linger in Egypt. While he had been trapped in Alexandria, his enemies had been regrouping. He marched north to deal with Pharnaces, the son of Mithridates, who was causing trouble in Pontus and Asia Minor. At the Battle of Zela in 47 BCE, Caesar's legions destroyed Pharnaces' forces in just 5 days of campaigning. It was such a quick, decisive victory that Caesar sent his famous message back to Rome: Veni, Vidi, Vici, I came, I saw, I conquered. 3 words that perfectly captured Caesar's speed, confidence, and flair for memorable phrases. But even with Pompey dead and the East secured, the civil war wasn't over. Pompey's supporters, led by his sons and by Cato the Younger, Caesar's most implacable enemy, had assembled a new army in North Africa. Caesar returned to Rome briefly in September 47 BCE, where he was made dictator again, then immediately sailed for Africa with his legions. The campaign in Africa was difficult. The enemy had the support of King Juba of Numidia, who provided additional troops and supplies. Caesar's forces landed with insufficient provisions and were harassed constantly. But at the Battle of Thapsus in April 46 BCE, Caesar's tactical genius prevailed again. His legions routed the enemy, and the slaughter was immense. Cato, rather than surrender to Caesar's clemency, chose to commit suicide at Utica. He read Plato's Phaedo, a dialogue about the immortality of the soul, then stabbed himself with his sword. When doctors tried to save him, Cato tore open his own wounds and died. Even in death, Cato defied Caesar, denying him the propaganda victory of pardoning his greatest enemy. Caesar returned to Rome in July 46 BCE as the undisputed master of the Roman world. The Senate granted him unprecedented honors and powers. He was made dictator for 10 years, given control of all armies, and awarded the right to declare war and make peace without consulting the Senate. They even voted him 4 triumphs, for Gaul, Egypt, Pontus, and Africa, all to be celebrated consecutively. It was the grandest celebration Rome had ever seen. For 40 days, Rome celebrated. Golden treasures from Gaul paraded through the streets. Exotic animals from Africa, including a giraffe that Romans had never seen before, were displayed to amazed crowds. Mock naval battles were staged in a flooded basin. Models of conquered cities were carried on floats. And in the Gallic triumph, walking in chains behind Caesar's chariot, was Vercingetorix, who had spent 6 years in that dark cell waiting for this moment. After the procession reached the Temple of Jupiter, Vercingetorix was taken back down to the Tullianum and strangled, as was Roman tradition for captured enemy leaders. His war was finally over. Caesar distributed gifts lavishly. Every Roman citizen received a payment of 100 denarii. Veterans of his legions received grants of land and money. He hosted enormous banquets, with 22,000 dining couches set up across the city. He was buying loyalty with the spoils of a decade of conquest, but he was also genuinely generous, understanding that power shared carefully was power multiplied. But Spain wasn't finished. Pompey's sons, Gnaeus and Sextus, had raised yet another army there, the last remnants of the resistance. In November 46 BCE, though he was now 54 years old and had been fighting almost continuously for years, Caesar marched to Spain for one final campaign. At the Battle of Munda in March 45 BCE, he faced his hardest fight. The battle hung in the balance for hours. Caesar's line wavered, and for a moment it seemed his luck had finally run out. Caesar himself grabbed a shield and rushed into the front line, shaming his troops with his courage. "Are you not ashamed," he shouted, "to deliver me into the hands of boys?" The legions rallied, and slowly, agonizingly, they pushed forward. By day's end, 30,000 of Pompey's soldiers lay dead. Gnaeus Pompey was hunted down and killed shortly after. Only Sextus escaped. The civil war was over. After 4 years of fighting fellow Romans across the Mediterranean, Caesar had won completely. He returned to Rome in October 45 BCE. The Senate heaped more honors on him: dictator for life, the title father of the fatherland, the right to wear his triumphal regalia at all times. His statue was placed among those of the ancient kings of Rome. The month of Quintilis was renamed Julius in his honor, our July. He was being elevated to something beyond mortal, beyond consul or general. He was becoming a king in all but name. And that would be his doom. Because Rome, founded in revolution against kings, would never accept a king again. Not even one named Caesar. But for now, as the year 45 turned to 44 BCE, Caesar stood at the absolute pinnacle of power. He had conquered Gaul, defeated his rivals, crossed the Rubicon and emerged victorious. He was 55 years old, the master of the known world, with plans for new Conchians, Parthia to avenge Crassus, then perhaps Germania, perhaps even beyond. The future seemed limitless. But time was running out faster than anyone knew. In the shadows, in quiet conversations, among men who called themselves defenders of the Republic, a conspiracy was forming. And in just a few months, on a day in March, everything would change.